I will not waste your time, colleagues. I think we should move on to the very first panel that we have. I will call upon our moderator for the session. It will be kept here in the room. Commissioner Subrayan Naidu, I welcome you. And with that, I will say, kindly introduce all the panelists. I hand over to you now. The reins are with you, Com. A round of applause as she takes the stage. Thank you very much. I think we should just continue where Tepang left us. He said, until they reach the stage, we clap. Until they sit down, we clap. Let's continue in that fashion. Over to you, Com.
Thank you, Program Director. Good morning, colleagues. This morning, I'm going to be moderating the session on gender, poverty, and the economy. Joining me today will be the following panelists. Ms. Busi Sibieko. Can you make your way to the... Give her a round of applause. Our very own former Commissioner, Dr. Janine Hicks. Ms. Isabel Fry. Ms. Safia Khan. And apologies if I'm pronouncing the next panelist's name incorrectly, Ms. Glenda Setshedi. Thank you very much. Just a few rules of our engagement panelists. You will be each given 3 minutes for opening remarks. I have a timekeeper in the audience. You will hear a buzzer at the end of 3 minutes, and you will be given a further 60 seconds to round up. All right? We will then go into an interactive session where I will pose a question to you, and you will then give me your feedback on that. And then we can have if time permits, Chairperson, we can have a closing remarks from the panelists. Thank you. Gender poverty and the economy. As part of the overall systemic exclusionary measures implemented during apartheid was the exclusion of black persons from the formal economy, and black women suffered disproportionately under these measures. The restriction of women in the Group Areas Act, the Native Land Act, and the creation and establishment of a homeland restricted the travel of women and access to trade opportunities and restricted them to activities within their homeland. Current legislation protects the formal sector, but the question that remains, who protects the informal sector? Arguments will be raised that the Department of Trade and Industry has strategies in place. However, are these adequate to protect the informal trade? We're going to open the discussion this morning by giving an opportunity to our panelists to address the informal market in opening remarks. We will start on my left and proceed thereafter. Remember, panelists, your time is 3 minutes. You will hear a buzzer. Thereafter, you have 60 seconds, sorry. Thank you.
Okay, morning. Let me start by saying all protocol observed. My name is Glenda, and I think I sit on this panel because I'm currently involved with development and incubation of startups in local townships, and I think that's not mentioned in the bio. But one thing that I wanted to open up my conversation with is we don't tell enough stories of black women succeeding, and I think we're not intentional about it. I was actually speaking to Valerie at the moment, just before the conference, to say our generation was running away from the cover woman who was either had children on her back and a bucket on her head, right? Which meant that we had to choose between the two. You could never be a woman, a mom, a successful mom, married, and still be able to choose education and still be successful in that right. It was almost like you were given running away from being that woman on the cover and choosing to be in academia or in business. And I think when I go back to the development of SMMEs, we find this a lot. The conversations at the bottom with informal traders, whether be it women or anything, they don't have access to information because women who do make it don't have the responsibility to go back to their communities and actually open up passage or doorways for women to actually access these platforms. So I think with that being said, I also want to draw back on just some of the and key experiences from my personal experience, which is excellence, you know. Excellence is classified as black excellence. You know, it's almost like we need to say women excellence, as if excellence has a particular bracket that it fits in. And I think we don't speak a lot about the fact that we could say, apart from saying women excellence, to just saying she is excellent in what she does. And move away from particularly saying women excellence or having, you know, that bracket of women in tech, you know, as almost like it's something that cannot be done. And I think with informal traders, we don't also speak about the process of succession beyond becoming an informal trader. That education is not accessible at the bottom, not at all. With the current number of startups that we incubate, out of the 730, some of them have remained small startups for almost 10 years. I mean, you know, that's enough time to graduate from being an SMME into a macro company, but you have remained a startup. And those are the conversations that we need to be asking, that yes, they're led by women, but why are we not having the conversation of them growing beyond SMMEs? And those are the industries that could actually make a change. I mean, I want to actually give spotlight on a story recently, on a conversation that we recently had. There are two girls that I met from Hammanskraal. They're called the Implanted twins. They have a digital X-ray glass innovation, and this was simply because they sat in a healthcare space and waited 4 hours to get an X-ray glass.
60 seconds
that's mine,
to round
60
up.
seconds. And the story of the Implanted twins, they came back from Turkey, and nobody recognized that these were young female innovators. They came back and nothing was said. When I came back from the US in terms of the Mandela Washington Fellowship, I was intentional about finding out why is it that we're not celebrating the innovation of these young girls. And this is where I found out the journey that they had to travel from Hammanskraal all the way to Makers Valley in Braamfontein just to create a prototype. So we're not intentional about making sure that these spaces are accessible to women.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Busi Sibeko, and I'm just going to be talking about the informal economy as a function of the macroeconomic order. Feminist economists have argued that sustaining capitalist production depends on more activities than what occur within the sphere of the market. So traditionally, we know the formal sector, production, and a lot of people forget that there's the non-market activities, which some people might argue the informal economy lies here, right? The economy, advanced by mainstream economics as merely a site of production and market-based activities, obscures the extensive social relations that are also essential for the reproduction of capital and the labor force. Feminist approaches to macroeconomic policy show gender relations as embedded in all social relations. So when we think about the informal economy and who is there, we must think about how macroeconomics reproduces the structural injustices that we see in our economy. I wanted to take you back to this quote by Silva Federici, which I think is very important. She says, the construction of a new patriarchal order, the making of women the servants of the male workforce, was a major aspect of capitalist development. On its basis, a new sexual division of labor could be enforced that differentiated that only the tasks that women and men should perform, but their experiences, their lives, their relation to capital and to other sectors of the working class. Thus, no less the intentional division of labor, the sexual division of labor was above all a power relation, a division within the workforce while being an immense boost to capital accumulation. So we must think about how the informal sector exists as a boost to capital accumulation. I'm going to talk about what one of our biggest threats in our economy are currently, which is austerity. We've spoken here, people talking about we don't have the resources and so forth, but there are alternatives, and austerity is a political economy decision. There's a lot of evidence internationally that shows that austerity reinforces the existing structural inequalities. So where we are seeing informal economy in our economy, right, in our society, it is likely to be reproduced with the current budgets that we're implementing, the political economy choice to continuously reproduce neoliberal, financialized capitalism. So the informal economy will continue to be reproduced with women in particular being there. I don't know how much time I've got left. I know 3 minutes is like short. But anyway, to end, my last sentence is to say economies are path dependent, and governments through planning, policies, and budgets can effect the change to the distribution of income, the allocation of finance towards productive investment and industrial transformation. And so the decision to deliberately not necessarily tackle the informal economy, and particularly through budgets, to tackle unpaid care work through budgets, to tackle underpaid work of women through budgets, the radical redistribution of resources happens through budget policy. And I think I want to just emphasize that we started using budgets as an accounting exercise, but they're actually economic policy, and economic policy has the power to dismantle, to reproduce, or worsen structural inequalities.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Isabel Fry, and I'm the founding and executive director of the Social Policy Initiative. And I'd just like to do a shout out to my team who are sitting in the audience. Thanks very much for this invitation. So at SPY, we intentionally use research and advocacy in order to promote a more just and equitable society with women in mind. So my 3 minutes, which start now, just going to look at building on what the previous two speakers have said. I mean, if you look at the small business SMME sector in South Africa, we can see, and I'm using the CIFA Corporate Annual Performance Plan 2023-2024, that just 26% of SMMEs are formally registered. So more than 70% are operating in the informal economy. We also know that only 34% of SMME owners employ other people. So 66% are own account workers, which in essence are survivalist workers, people who are not able to earn salaried income and who are forced out into informal activities. Now, if we look at unemployment rates in South Africa, we know that South Africa's got the highest unemployment rate in the world, but that's much higher amongst women. So while men have an unemployment rate of 40%, which is shocking and staggering, women are living with an unemployment rate of 46%. And so those women who are caregivers are needing to earn income in different ways. Now, why does this continue the inequality for women? It does so because if we look at the breakdown of employment in South Africa, 55% of households earn income from employment. 23% the primary income source are social grants, and others 10% are businesses. So then we look at the distinction in employment income, and we see that households that are headed by women that are dependent on employment income have only 25% of the level of income of the same households that are headed by male workers. So in essence, there is a three-quarter income differential from women-headed households to male-headed households, which is highly significant when you see that 45% of children are raised in women-headed households. So not only are women earning less and more likely to be unemployed, but also the bulk of children are raised by households headed by women. So the additional cost of care, the additional cost of ensuring that children have a safe environment are, again, an obstacle to women raising enough income. I think if you look at the question of where women are employed as well, that's significant. So of the 7.4 million women who are employed in South Africa, 5.1 million are employed in the formal sector, but that includes 1 million women who are working in the informal economy and another 900,000 women who are working in either as farm workers or within the domestic economy. And so again, the types of employment and the kind of income that's being earned are significantly lower. And so if we then look at the levels of grant income, because we often get told that there's a dependency amongst grants and that women are sitting back not doing anything. Compared to the national minimum wage, which is 4,600 Rand per month, we look at the various grant incomes. Child support grant, which is received by 13 million children, is only 530 Rand per month. And the old age pension is only 2,180. So you compare that just to the minimum wage, and we can see that the differential in terms of income earning, women earn incredibly much lower rates than men. So then we look, I just want to conclude by looking at the 370 grant. I think just to begin with, every person in this country is entitled to social security in their own right. And the concerns that we have in our feminist analysis of grant income is that women are generally receive it only as caregivers. So it's your reproductive rights that are awarded, rather than the fact that you have an integrity as a human being, as a woman, and should be receiving income in that. So the 370 Rand, which is the Social Relief of Distress grant. We know from recent figures that 9 million women were applied for it in the month of April, whereas only 7 million men. So we can already see that women are far more dependent on it. At SPY, we produced a movie with UNICEF on the uses of the 350 grant as it was then. Every single beneficiary that we interviewed, used the money to try and start a new business. And that was amazing. And I mean, you could see, like, from women selling ice lollies on the side of the road. And yet, as soon as you start earning money, Treasury takes it away because you exceed the means test. So we believe that universal access to income is the way to ensure women are able to move forward in the informal economy.
I feel like we're speed dating here. Thank you. But happily, the input that I would like to make builds on the inputs and the information that has been shared already. So my name is Janine Hicks. I'm from UKZN School of Law. But I also sit on the South African Law Reform Commission Project 143 on maternity and parental care and benefits for self-employed workers. And the input I'd like to share is how this privileging of the formal economy impacts then on the discrimination of women in the informal economy, in policy choices that are made by the state and their working conditions. And I'd like to offer information and a solution in that regard. So the core issue is that when we look at our social security for workers, it's framed in accordance with the rights of employees. So only people who are formally recognized by our labor legislation as an employee, in other words, having an employer, being in a formal employment relationship, can contribute to UIF and therefore can claim unemployment insurance and can claim paid maternity leave, and if you're a partner of such person, have access to parental leave. So the implications then of that for women, for own account workers, for women who are in the informal economy, means that they have no access to social security. There is no paid maternity leave. And yet we have constitutional guarantees to social security. We're signatory to all kinds of conventions and treaties in relation to maternity benefits, and the impact on those households and on those workers and the kinds of sexual and reproductive choices they make about whether they can afford to have a child, the care for a child, breastfeeding and caregiving of a child in the early stages, and the impact on women's business. So Isabel has pointed to implications of women's household responsibilities. We know because of our gendered power dynamics within families that sits 2.5 times more on the shoulders of women, and that care work is unpaid. And we know that as a result of that influences the kinds of career choices that women make. Where our women are in the economy, Isabel pointed to that. We're in the informal economy. We're in insecure, low-paid, low-status jobs. And when we look to what are the actual then conditions of women in the informal sector, and the kinds of issues that came through when I was a commissioner at the CGE and we received a complaint in this regard, inadequate infrastructure, inadequate shelter, no childcare facilities, no breastfeeding care facilities, but above all, this impact on women's businesses when they need to take time out around the birth of a child. I'm delighted to say that through the work of the CGE back in those days, working with COSATU, we made this a working women's policy issue. We percolated it up, I believe, through the Tripartite Alliance and the influence of COSATU on policy choices. But we lobbied furiously the Departments of Justice and Employment and Labour. This was made an issue for law reform. It sat before the Law Reform Commission. We held consultations with a whole range of stakeholders. We worked with the South African Self-Employed Women's Association, and we have proposed law reform that was accepted by the Law Reform Commission. It's unfinished business. It was accepted by the 6th administration. We need to follow up now with the 7th administration. Where are those recommendations sitting? And in a nutshell, what has been proposed is that the definition of employee should be changed to include women in the informal economy and that category of workers. Great, a minute. That they should be permitted to contribute to the UIF. You know, we have this 1% by the worker, 1% by, whoops, who's the employer? We've said the state should subsidize that, and we've drawn on models where this does work. So the state would subsidize that we set a minimum level for a maternity paid leave, because often a worker's income levels are so low that it would not be sufficient. A 66% of her normal earnings would not be sufficient to care for herself and the child. And so that should be subsidized by the state. But I think two huge things. We can look at social insurance, but there's an obligation to provide social assistance to categories of women. I'm delighted to say that a key point was to extend backwards the child support grant to pregnancy. There have been numerous stakeholders who've called for this. We had support for this from DSD, that the child support grant should in fact date from conception, that it's available to a woman for the 9 months of her pregnancy, that it would be converted to a child support grant on the birth of the child, and that it is available. And the implications for the early child development are enormous. And correlated then with that is for DSD and for our Department of Basic Education to be rolling out early child development and childcare and support close to where informal traders work from. So we need this taken up again. So thank you.
Thank you, Janine. I look at a lot of data work, and I love hearing solutions. When I hear solutions to problems, a buzzer goes off in my head. So thank you for those propositions. I think that they sound great. We just got to get them to implementation. So my name is Sophia Khan. I'm a lecturer at UCT. My work is around women in the labor market, domestic work and the inclusion of women in the labor force, poverty reduction, the extent of inequality, wealth, subsidies for employment, and reproduction and childcare in the home. So before we discuss the informal sector, I wanted us to start off by looking at the profile of women who are in the informal sector. And if we start off by Amartya Sen's definition of development as freedoms, what freedoms do these women have and what freedoms do they not have? So in capitalism, a woman's capabilities or freedom is directly linked to the amount of income she gets from her wage. And if she's not getting income from a wage, then the question becomes, where can she access resources to allow her to access the baseline freedoms that she needs to look after herself, empower herself, and look after those around her. These women often are in positions where they have severe amounts of time poverty because their childcare burdens and their burdens at home are extremely high. For these women in the informal sector, compared to men, there are multiple children in the household. In fact, men in the informal sector often have no children in the household. So their time constraints are different, and they're able to be outside of the home seeking employment. The household size is bigger, not only in terms of children, but also in terms of adults in the household and pensioners in the household. There's a higher level of indebtedness, and this indebtedness is not necessarily only to the bank. It could be from the community person providing loans or from family members. There is a large amount of energy poverty in the home. So things like heating in winter, protection from storms, basic access to a basic human right, electricity and sanitation. These things are questionable for these women in these households. Over and above this, when you look at women in the informal sector trying to operate businesses, because of gender norms, they face discrimination in being able to start these businesses. So what happens is that they become ring-fenced or confined to specific areas of work that are deemed respectable or gender appropriate. So these gender norms obviously work to a disadvantage of these women. And the discrimination that they face within the home in terms of their childcare burdens and in terms of their time poverty affects their ability to create a business, and through creating a business, access freedoms. Some of the previous
60 seconds.
already. Oh my word! Some of the previous speakers spoke about protection of the informal sector. And I would like to come at that from a different angle. Instead of protection, I think we need to talk about access first. If some of my colleagues in the department are doing work on the list of bureaucratic things you need to do to be able to register a business as formal, and somehow we've overlooked this, we've inherited it from the apartheid government whose mandate was deliberately to crush small entrepreneurs, to crush the nuclear family, to crush the concept of a home. So we need to start by removing the barriers to entry. And after the barriers to entry can be removed, we can then talk about protection, like Janine talked about. Another important point is that informal work is vulnerable and precarious. Is that my time? And I just wanted to note that we need things like social insurance for the vulnerability and precariousness of this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks. A lot has been said about informal trade, but I want to take you back in time to what we would call a dark time in our country. Let's go back in time to the 26th of March, 2020. When President Ramaphosa announced that we are in a state of emergency, we are in a total shutdown. I want us to hone in on the informal sector, specifically looking at those kokos selling ngwenias on the side of the road, our domestic workers, many of whom work under conditions where they are not registered with the Department of Labor, and these are conditions they have accepted. So let us go into that, and let me ask you, and let me start with you, Commissioner Hicks. Is formalization of informal workers and the small, medium enterprises the most appropriate approach for inclusion in the economy?
Okay. So I'm sure people in the sector know about the ILO recommendation 204. Which has a grand title of transitioning from the informal economy to the formal economy. So the aspiration is there to transition workers in the informal economy predominantly to ensure that they have access to the protections, labor protections and social security protections of the formal economy. But and we've ratified that convention, by the way, as South Africa. We've not ratified the ILO Maternity Benefits Convention, but we've ratified the ILO recommendation 204 on transitioning from the informal to the informal, informal to the formal. And this has gone quite far with the Department of Labor and looking at what mechanisms need to be put in place. There will always be pushback because that then requires regulation. So there are questions of should this be optional? Do all entities want to be registered, paying tax, operating in the formal space? There are protections and advantages that come with that. There are advantages for the economy, of course. What we had proposed around maternity benefits is that this is optional. If you want to have access to the state mechanism for social security, then you have to come into the state apparatus. You would have to register, And the state should adjust then the way in which it interacts with workers, that the registration fees in the process should be made less onerous, that we should recognize that in the informal economy, your income fluctuates. You may do very well in December and January and February, and come June, your income has completely reduced. So we should take an average of workers' earnings to calculate what percentage contributions should be. So all I want to say is that there are models, that there's an international framework for formalizing and regulating, that there are models of how that can be done. We need to specifically bring a mindset to understand the realities of informal economy workers and adjust our bureaucracy so that it is accessible and that it works for these workers. But ultimately it comes down to those business owners themselves. Do they want to opt in or opt out? And people will make their choices accordingly.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Sitsiedi, can you tell me, how have women's livelihoods been sustained in the absence of formal assistance?
I think I want to actually go back to the question that you actually posed to her and then also answer mine in the process. I want to go back to the part where she speaks about the formalization of small businesses, and I think this is something that we deal with a lot on the ground. If we don't speak about the formalization, and I normally say this at women conferences when we speak with business, that compliance is meant to regulate, but compliance keeps you in and doesn't keep you outside, and that's the narrative that we need to change. With particularly banking institutions and access to financing, you cannot access those institutions without the proper registration and processes. And that's the conversation that we need to have. The reason why most SMMEs that are run by females remain small businesses for such a long process is the fact that they don't graduate or get formally registered into growing their businesses further. And then I want to go back. Can you repeat the question again? See, I'm quick to answer the ones that are very personal.
How have women's livelihood been sustained without formal assistance?
Sure, I think women have done amazing thus far without any formal assistance. The one thing that I was actually looking at even just last night is the majority of the industries that are associated with women businesses. I mean, women generally gravitate towards community and social development businesses than what they gravitate to maybe industrial or production and manufacturing. And so I just think women's, I ran a blank there. So particularly when you look at how women have been supported or how they've actually been able to sustain themselves without the formal support, they've done amazing. But they've also gotten to a point where they need to also grow beyond talking conversations surrounding succession plans of how businesses get sustained beyond their current status. And I think the one other thing that I actually wanted to mention was just how the particularly capitalist system associates income with being the head of the household. I don't think we have the conversation that women can head businesses and also be powerful in their particular right. I think the one thing that we talk about a lot is how capitalism has continued to actually support this male-dominated industry of structure and making sure that the breadwinner is the male in that particular regard. But I think in terms of how women have been, sure, I think that question just ran away, hey? I think I prepared so much. So definitely, I think I just want to give somebody else so that I can gather my thoughts again of how they have actually been supported. Thank you.
Ms. Khan, if you could come in and tell us, thank you, what innovative ways have come to pass to ensure the inclusion of women in our economy?
Wow, I got the tough one. I got the most difficult question. What innovative ways have, like policy or people in the industry? What creative ways? Just repeat the question.
What innovative ways have come to pass to ensure the inclusion of women in the economy?
Okay, when we talk about inclusion of women in the economy, we obviously need to distinguish between the formal economy and the informal economy. I think, honestly speaking, as a feminist researcher and scholar, what's kept women in the informal economy is just utter and sheer dedication and brute force of the women themselves, because they face circumstances. I listed the kinds of poverties that they face and constraints that they face. Access to things like microfinance and small base loans is also extremely important in having these women maintain and run their businesses. But for me, the most non-negligible thing is the social safety net at the bottom of the income distribution. Without that social safety net, there isn't a baseline for these women to work in the economy. That guaranteed lump sum of money at the end of the month means that you can take a small loan and pay it back. That you, even if your revenue is low, you have something coming in to cover expenses. And there is, I think, in the kind of neoliberal discourse, there's a lot of conversation on how much is the social safety net costing us. And if you look at the work that's been done on measuring the impact of social safety nets, the benefit outweighs the cost immensely. My comrade here said, a lot of these grants and payments are given to women based on their social reproduction abilities. What's interesting is that even though the implicit patriarchy assigns this lump sum in that way, these women are able to take that money and empower themselves and somehow exit that that kind of ideological imposition. So you are a woman, you need to stay at home and look after the children. I got this money, I'm going to start a shop. I got this money, I'm going to start a service. I got this money, I'm going to buy a sewing machine. So I think there's a few things. The one is the social safety net. The other one is microfinance and access to small loans. The other thing is community. Because without community, these businesses are not able to run. They are not a shop in a mall that pays rent to a landlord. You are borrowing from your friends are spotting you, your granny is looking after the child, your auntie is coming to drop food if you have a business day. So without community, informal businesses are not able to exist. And I don't know, I am not sure that I've seen that point made clear anywhere. I just wanted to also distinguish between types of informal businesses, because we just lump sum everything. There's a difference between an SMME and a gogo who is buying a sewing machine and fixing dresses at her house. There's a big difference. And when we talk about formalization, I think the commonsensical understanding of what we have in mind is, oh, we have like a structure, an SMME with a boss and like workers. But there are other types of informal businesses that require support but don't require bureaucracy like registration. How must your auntie who's cooking food and selling it for like funerals and weddings, how must she register her business? Do you know what I'm saying? That burden already to register oneself for grants, etc., stand in queues is such a heavy burden, a burden on time use, a burden on resources. So when we think about things like formalization, we need to be clear what kind of businesses we're talking about. And then one more thing, the informal sector and poverty alleviation in South Africa would not exist without the domestic work labor force. And that's 1.5 million women, black women and colored women, quickly, going to work every day and sometimes in excruciating circumstances to get a wage, often a wage below minimum wage. And what that does for poverty alleviation is non-negligible. And it challenges two things. It challenges the woman's role in the household as the breadwinner, and it also challenges, I forgot the second point. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Fry, to wrap up our quick Q&A with us and the panel, we have changes that are made to the informal sector. We have strategies, policies, legislation, but the reach to the informal community, those traders in the informal community, is not always possible. We can try through education, etc., but not everything reaches everyone. What can we do to ensure that these changes that happen, as and when it happens, reaches those in the informal sector?
Thanks. My answer to that one is simple, and that is that we need to have universal coverage of support. What we've seen through the neoliberal, I didn't know that words capitalism and neoliberal were going to be so freely used here. It's really great. What we've seen through the neoliberal approach is that the introduction of targeting, which means that that percentage of the population is going to get that assistance, that percentage is going to get that. It's impossible to navigate that, particularly if you are marginalized and on the outskirts of access. So if we look globally at the data that looks at universal support, universal access, it's far greater because you know what it is. We know that there are different ways in which local government, provincial government, and national government can reinforce this. But I mean, the point that I've heard repeated time and time again is that of the safety net. If we know that there is a universal safety net, which is a decent safety net, it enables people to not only have bread and butter for today, but also to start planning for tomorrow. And I just want to refer to Kenya. There's a pilot on universal basic income. And it's interesting because they looked at 3 different subsets. They looked at one which was just one asset donation, so one lump sum donation. They looked at a 2-year cash grant program, and they looked at a permanent. It was 12 years in the making. Because a lot of leadership says, well, you have to get women to graduate off support. Now, the findings that have been held so far is that the once-off asset was actually, it was consumed by the household. So what was meant to buy the sewing machine, etc., because people didn't know where tomorrow's money was going to come from, they ate it today. With regards to the 2-year universal basic income grant as well, that was very short term in terms of how the money was used. It was slightly better. But in terms of the longer term, the sort of virtual permanent guarantee that tomorrow's income was guaranteed that you could build on, the recipients of that used that to start businesses, to invest in education, because they had a dream and a hope that could be manifested because of looking after today. And I love the description of how different people are looking at income support, because when you look at South Africa, we have a dual economy. We know that. We've got the former largely white apartheid-supported economy, and we have the bulk of people's realities that is not confined within that. We inherited a social security system that was built for white male breadwinners. And suddenly, after 1994, that was expanded. But there's no coverage for working age people within the income support. So the idea of enabling people, traders, informal workers, majority women, to save for the rainy day is essential. But we can't force women into a situation which is not theirs. We've got to understand what those realities are, and we need to see how that contribution can happen. So instead, perhaps, of getting a tax break, if you're an SMME, you can have state contribution to your social security. So when you need to draw down on that, and there are a couple of examples in India, for instance, the Self-Employed Workers Union or Women's Union. We don't need to we don't have to create the wheel, but we need to be humble enough to say, let's learn from different sectors, because it is by ensuring that women, that the backbone of our society is strengthened, that we can survive. Because otherwise, we are in a critical situation in this country. More and more people are existing beyond the formal, and we're not creating safety lines for them to be included.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm now going to open the floor for questions from our audience. I'm going to take 5 questions. I see hand number 1. Where's our mic? Commissioner Gumede, you're noted. Any further questions from the audience? Okay, we'll take that speaker and then Commissioner Gumede. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I only have 2 questions, comments, but I want to ask the panel. Firstly, the Commission needs to look at why, after 30 years of democracy, there are still women farm owners who can't access land, and what are the causes of that? Because there are women in the Eastern Cape, KZN, who want to be farm owners and actually produce and distribute, but they can't because they are they are not allowed to own land. They're supposed to present to some council, tribal council, court, or whatever, and present their work for them to be able to do this. The second one is I haven't heard anything about sex work. Government has been promising to formalize and decriminalize sex work, and those women are unsafe, but also financially unstable. What are we doing? Why has this not been done? What is holding it back? I promise I'm done. But the last one, when you were talking about innovation.
I'm allowing you because we only have Commissioner Gumede with questions, and knowing that I probably have 5
Okay,
other
cool.
questions.
But the last one, I am a content creator, and I know we don't talk about that a lot because it's not known, but you were talking about innovation. And a lot of single moms, even in the township and rural areas, are making money or trying to make money online. But the problem is because of local regulations, things like TikTok doesn't pay South Africans and other Africans for creating content, but pays Americans and others in Asia. We could be making money and empowering women, but local regulations in South Africa are making that difficult. But I also know that it's the market pool that's a problem. But how can government get involved to ensure that women who do this work, because I could be sitting at home and making Get Ready with me and get paid because you enjoy that content. I know people don't talk about it, but it's innovative, it's new. We are a digital world. Thank you.
Commissioner Gumede?
Thank you so much, Commissioner Supriya Naidu. That was a very stimulating conversation. I didn't think it was going to go in the route of entrepreneurship and SMMEs, and I'm inspired to give an account purely because my background is in entrepreneurship, and I've been doing it for a very long time. And South Africa is an incredibly hostile environment, not only for women, but particularly for black women. And I'm happy that we also can locate the fact that our historical context plays a tremendous role in how the economy is shaped, because we are constantly speaking in very broad terms, generic terms. The economy is violent and harmful to women, but in particular is violent and harmful to black women. And that needs to be said, and it needs to be highlighted constantly. I have a statistic that is quite scary. It's a pre-COVID statistic, just before the pandemic hit, and I'm quite certain that considering some of the austerity measures that were taken by various lenders and banks, it might have gotten worse. But by the time COVID hit, about 4.5% of all women-owned business had access to venture capital funding for their businesses. And about 0.2% of those were actually black women in South Africa. And considering the fact that many funding or lending institutions had to kind of pull back as a result of the pandemic, I'm quite certain that it's even worse. Now, the other thing is that competition in South Africa has been regulated along the lines of race, more than along the lines of gender, as well as race and gender and all of the other intersectional elements. And so what we find is that even black people, in fact black men, participate in unfair competition practices. There are industries like the private medical laboratory space in South Africa where you have got white, male-dominated companies that are owning about 90% of that space, and it is unregulated. They even go so far as to buy bloods from doctors. So you go to a doctor, you go and you get your test done, but the doctor has got an arrangement with a private medical laboratory to say, I will pay you 60,000 Rand a month for you to give me this blood. And so when a woman entrepreneur, such as myself, tries to enter into that market as a specialist, someone who's knowledgeable in that area, they can't survive in the market because they now have to have 60,000 Rand to pay all of these doctors to bribe them to be able to access the market.
Gumede, I have to be fair, you have 60 seconds.
Thank you so much. The other thing is that government itself is very biased in how they give entrepreneurial opportunities in the form of procurement. And what we need to do, just as a way going forward, is to say, insofar as government-related businesses, funding opportunities, procurement is concerned, what we need to do as an institution is to investigate who are these entrepreneurs that get this money? What is the relationship between themselves and government that they get special treatment of millions? We need to interrogate also venture capital funding in South Africa and make it mandatory for there to be equitable funding in South Africa. And then finally, our role as an institution ought to be to create and to develop regulations around venture capital funding and around procurement in the country that will make sure that these industries are no longer under-regulated and are also not totally unregulated moving forward, to ensure that women, and especially black women, have got an equal opportunity to compete in the market and to stay and to sustain themselves in the marketplace.
Thank you, Commissioner Gumere. I think there were three, yours was more of a comment than a question. So there was 3 questions posed by, you didn't introduce yourself. Okay. God conquers everything. Thanks, Chairperson. I'm chairing. Okay, your first question regarding access to land. The Commission launched a report a month ago. Am I correct, CEO? Have you had regard to it? You haven't. Please do. It's on our website. Thank you. I'm going to open up to the panel for question 2 and 3. Commissioner Hicks, sex worker, formalizing and decriminalizing.
Thanks. I wanted to, I see the power of the microphone. I want to comment on land, and then I will get to sex work. There is that undeniable link between the gendered nature of poverty, women's access to and ownership of land, and land tenure security. And we know that our land reform process has failed women, mostly because the focus has been on restitution of prior title to land which women have not held. And within the context of an Ingonyama trust, we definitely need to be looking at models for addressing that colonial, patriarchal, historic legacy of women's access to land. Yes, when we talk about informal economy, we must focus on vulnerable categories of workers. We look at women on farms, we consider women seasonal workers, but the issue of women and men and transgender people in the sex work industry, I hope, and I'm looking squarely at you, Chairperson, I hope this, under your leadership, that this term of commissioners will stick its neck out and call unequivocally for the decriminalization of sex work. There is a rights-based argument and a constitutional case to be made for the decriminalization of sex work, which I enjoin this term to consider. The last thing I wanted to say, particularly examining the condition of vulnerable categories of workers, is for us to consider as well the local policy framework. We tend to neglect what's happening within the local space. We have I come from KwaZulu-Natal, we have a KZN informal economy policy, and we have eThekwini municipality informal economy policy. I believe we need that interrogation by, again, the Commission at that local level to ensure that that local policy framework is responding to the needs of all categories of workers within that space, and that an enabling and a supportive environment is created for workers at the local level. Cleverly getting my other points in.
Thank you, Commissioner Hicks. Our last question was content creation and innovation for creating content. Who would like a bite at that?
Can I just add? I think I just wanted to, my earlier comments, I want us to step back, and it comes back to this question about sex work, and what is work, right? And I think we are in a place where we say workers, such and such workers, but we have to remember that within, and this is why it's specific, the neoliberal financialized capitalist model is specific about who is a worker. And there's a reason why women in particular who become recipients or are in need of social protection are seen as the undeserving poor, because unpaid care work is not seen as work, right? And so it's the same with sex work. What is it about this sector? And we have to kind of think about what are the sectors of our economy. What is it about sex work that agitates the political economy? Why would we not want to decriminalize it, right? And I think some of these questions, including the digital economy, What are the aspects of it? Is it control? Is it the inability to tax it? What is it about that particular sector that agitates the status quo, right? So the informal economy, as it's being reproduced, the question for me is actually to step back to say, how does it serve the political economy? And it serves it because it is this sector where you don't have to provide provisions for people, where people are precarious within this capitalistic model. So it actually serves capitalism to have an informal economy. So the reason I started at a macro level is because we need to ask ourselves, yes, we want solutions to people who are in the informal economy now, but we have to ask ourselves bigger questions about what is it about this informal economy that prevails and continues? And do we want it to be like this? Actually, the question is, what kind of economy do we want? Who must this economy serve? And there was questions here about women ownership and so forth. And one of the things I've been thinking about is, I know we want women to own businesses, but what about community-led ownership? What about other models of ownership? And I think we get caught into these binaries about how do we fix the immediate problem, but actually we are seeing bigger structural issues continue. So we can put a Band-Aid on a lot of these economic problems, but actually what is really needed is, and what I call is a rupture of social reproduction, right? And social reproduction including both market and non-market spheres. And I'm just going to put a last point about, there was a comment about graduation and productive capacity of SMMEs. So here I'm going to put on my master's hat. So my paper was about township economy. And one of the things I argued is that no economy has ever been developed from SMMEs, right? So what we need to be giving SMMEs is actually learning rents, and that means helping them develop the productive capacity to grow. Not just giving them neoliberal support, we'll give you mentorship to do your business, but actually to say, how do we build large firms? And how do you build large firms? Is that someone who's got a quota stand sometimes just needs you to give them another gas, what do you call it, like a gas heater thing to make more. And in fact, you telling them this is how you access the mainstream market doesn't always necessarily help. So we need to think differently about how to support development in our country, and that includes budget support to those sectors.
Thank you. Panelists, I'm going to give you 2 minutes. 1 minute for reflection, 1 minute for a resolution. Starting from that end.
There's a mic there.
No excuse.
I can't promise that what I'm going to say is any good, but I will try. Okay, I think in reflection, there's a few things that we can say, and the one is about the kind of variation in what we see in the informal sector, so different definitions of what the informal sector consists of. But there is a consistency, and the consistency is that women are in a disadvantageous position compared to men throughout the economy, and it is amplified in the informal sector around the notion of what work can be counted towards a capitalistic productive economy. What the kind of neoliberal agenda wants to include are things that are, in inverted commas, respectable. So sex work, for instance, doesn't get included because it's not considered a respectable occupation. I was talking to a friend last night, and she said her kid in grade 2, they asked the class, what do you want to be? And the class said YouTubers, influencers, and professional gamers. When we were growing up, that wasn't even in our frame of reference. So the economy is changing, and as always, regulation lags behind. But there is importance. Sometimes when my nieces show me TikToks, there's some with 20 million views, and if 20 million views can get you some income, we need to really work on that. We need to see what is preventing these young people from benefiting from this online market compared to other people in the world. Why is it that there's this stratification that people in America or the EU get to earn money for their videos, but we don't? And so, there's
resolution?
My resolution is that we need practical ways to alleviate the kind of burden of time poverty and difficulty of women in the informal sector. And my ultimate conclusion is we need universal basic income. Yeah, so to provide that support, and we can talk afterwards.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, colleagues.
Mine are 3 levels. One is I think we need to identify and tackle institutionalized discrimination and acknowledge how our legislative framework perpetuates inequality and discrimination, and tackle and address that. So that's looking, for instance, I just, as almost a case study, showed you the Unemployment Insurance Act legislation and the UIF, and how the terminology and the definitions just exclude a whole category of workers. That is constitutional discrimination. CEO, we made a case purely on the basis of an equality case that constitutes discrimination, and it's unfair discrimination. Let's name it, let's challenge it, let's overturn it. We have a transformative constitution, let's use the power that is available there. And focus as well. We have, if you read the language of informal economy policy, it paints this beautiful picture recognizing the contribution of the informal economy, family and household security and livelihoods and poverty, and yet at every level we seek to destroy the informal economy and make it so difficult and impossible for people to prosper in that space. So we've got to address the disconnect between the policy language and the actual reality. So that's the one category, also with a solution in there, because I can't go straight, I have to go sideways. The second category is around the protection of vulnerable stakeholders within those sectors. So yes, support the successful case studies and instances of women in business, but also recognize the need for expanding social insurance and social assistance models, which include the universal support model, which time and time again, and our data is firmly behind it, shows it works. The third thing that we're all sitting with, and it's the elephant in the room, which is the gendered division of labor. This burden of child and household care and responsibility, which because of our patriarchal backdrop enforced by our capitalist neoliberal framework societies, puts on the shoulders of women, does not recognize it, impacts on women's sexual and reproductive health rights, and impacts directly on women's economic participation within the economy. And I think that's something that this conference is grappling with as well, is how do we address that gendered discrimination, gendered division of labor. And it comes down to prejudice and attitudes and perceptions towards the roles and reproductive roles of women and men in society. As a weird kind of final recommendation in that regard, we make it very hard for men to play a care role. We give them 10 days paid leave. We make it hard for successful men within businesses to say, I can't be at that meeting, I've got my daughters in a ballet performance. We need to make it acceptable for men to step into the care role, to step into the nurturing space, which means a whole lot of normative shifts and policy shifts within the workplace to make it okay and normal for men to play that care role, and shift that off women's shoulders.
Thank you. Ms. Fry?
Thank you. I find it really interesting that when we talk about successful women, we talk about women who go through the formal sector and employment. I think for me, I talk to male friends of mine who refer to their mothers and say, these were strong women, you strike a woman, that was a hard woman, and their wives are weak. And I say, but women don't want to have to be hard. Is this not what freedom means? That we can actually be the kind of nurturer, that we can be soft, that we can love and care. And that's the thing about a single mother, and I'm a single mum, is my daughter often says to me, why are you so hard? I'm hard because everything rests on my shoulders. I've got to leave early because I have to go and fetch her from writing mock matric. But so the first is, let's recognize the freedom to be. I think the point, one of the amazing things about the COVID time, probably the only one, was that households have poverty levels in South Africa actually came to a virtual zero at that point in time because you had the additional funding to the caregiver, you had the social relief of distress, and you had the top up to the grants. So the most vulnerable were actually have never been better off than during COVID. And the impact on the NIDS CRAM survey was that mental well-being of women had never been stronger. That was it. It wasn't that they all started their own business. It was that they were less depressed, less anxious, and more relieved. And I think we need to recognize how important that is. The talk has been about the fact that healing hasn't happened. Let's look at ways in which we can give healing. I mean, I was so angry with Department of Social Development and Treasury around the social relief of distress grant, because in December of 2020, when the first 6 months had expired, and the social relief of distress was the only income support that was expanded, it wasn't available to caregivers. Because why? Because they were getting children's grants. Therefore, they were not eligible to have social relief of distress. And we did a legal opinion and took it and engaged, and that was rectified. But again, the automatic thing is you only get paid for your reproductive rights and not as in your own rights. So I think my final point is I often have battles with policymakers around this definition of welfare. Now, when you talk about a welfare state, for me, that is the most developmental state that you can ever have. A welfare state is a state that looks after the welfare of individuals so that they can collectively develop, fulfill their potential, raise the level of development within society. When people say we don't want a welfare state, I say, why not? Why is the welfare, why is the well-being of every person not our priority? And I would really encourage people to look back. It has been called for twice already on this panel. A universal basic income is not something that creates dependency. It recognizes basic needs and creates a minimum floor. And if you look at the research that SPY published at the beginning of this year, authored by Duma Krabule, if you have a decent universal basic income, it can be 96% self-financing. We don't need to tax to get it because of the multiplier that is inherent in it that supports businesses. You cannot say to people, start a micro business when nobody in your community has disposable income to support it. But that recognition, that multiplier, the solution is in our hands. We just need to have the courage to think differently.
Thank you. I think in reflecting, I think there's an immediate thing that we have to look at, which is, again, I want to go back to austerity because the evidence shows that we're going to be experiencing higher unemployment, poverty, and inequality. And that is global evidence, right? So we need to be thinking short-term and long-term. So yes, we want a universal basic income grant, but what's going to happen within the context of austerity is we're going to get a universal basic income grant, but a regression in other basic services. So I actually want to say the proposal is not just a universal basic income grant, but the universal access to basic services as well, as part and parcel. And because universal basic services are critical to that unpaid care work at home, right? How do you reproduce the worker, a child, when you don't have water? And in my PhD, I'm actually looking at the difference between access and use. In South Africa, we've got this tendency to say, 13 million people now have access to electricity, but the question is, we have a user fee model. So how many people are able to use it? And so when we talk about the universal access and usage of basic services, we have to rethink how these nice numbers look. I think the other thing is just to emphasize how Oxfam and other feminists have actually called austerity economic violence. We've been talking about violence throughout this conference, right? And economic violence is a real thing, right? And it reproduces itself. So I think one of the things to also say is when we think the gender responsive budgeting process is coming up, and I think one of the things we're going to have to challenge, and in an upcoming paper that we're going to publish, this is one of the arguments I make, is that we've actually turned gender responsive budgeting into a technocratic process, which actually naturalizes power rather than challenges it. So we have to make sure that in those gender responsive budget guidelines that are going to be coming up, that there's transformative real policy, right? And the NDP only mentions unpaid care work once. Once. I searched it. It mentions unpaid care work once. And when it mentions unpaid care work, it talks about women's access to the labor market. And I think we have to go back into not making a business case for basic services, but a human rights case. People shouldn't get UBIs and all these great things just because we want them to be part of an extractive capitalist model. People deserve, and I don't like using the word deserve, but deserve basic services and basic income as a dignity. We spoke about dignity yesterday. As part of that dignity package, so almost like we can call it a dignity package for South Africa. But anyway, and last thing, I know my time's up, is to always ask, are our budgets, particularly our macroeconomic policy, is it speaking to the Constitution?
Yeah.
So when we compare it to what our Constitution says it wants to do, is our macroeconomic policy responding to that? And again, is it responding to our national development goals? And we need to address this inconsistency that is happening or disconnect between our goals and what we are doing now to achieve them in the long run.
Thank you. And finally,
So in closing, I just want to actually go back to the reason why women start businesses. And I think the one thing that we've ignored a lot in this conversation is the fact that most women who go into business or informal trade go in on the basis of survival. They don't go in the basis of sustainability. So we look at entrepreneurship from a different lens than that I'm starting a business not necessarily to build something that is sustainable and long-lasting. I'm starting a business simply to survive. So the conversation needs to change with women to start businesses on sustainability as opposed to survivalist. And then I also want to encourage private sector to be held accountable, because we don't actually take into consideration that when a private corporate like USave, ShopRite, goes into the local townships and starts making magwinyas, what they're doing is actually taking money away from the informal person that's practicing on the corner. So these are the conversations that we're having. So we are encouraging informal in traders and women to register their business, but these very same big corporates aren't accountable or held accountable to these formal in traders. And there's no inclusion plan in that process. The one thing that we've also advocated for with working around policy is that the women that sit on policy and big corporates, and I always say this with particularly shopping malls in local areas, nobody questions whether we have participation of locals in those shopping malls. When you look at, for example, I come from a place called Hammanskraal, Jubilee. Jubilee is a huge giant. I mean, Jubilee literally has a million feet count in a day, and we don't have any locals participating in that economy. Who's asking those questions? And I think we need to particularly ask it on behalf of women. And then in closing, I want to look at, for example, I want to close with education, right? And the need for entrepreneurship accessibility education for women. And I think this is not particularly spoken about a lot in South Africa. We look at countries like Rwanda that has now formalized entrepreneurship as education to build sustainable businesses. And something that we're not talking about is how do we move our economy from entrepreneurship being a subject of study to be able to build businesses that live beyond just the survivalist status quo and go into sustainability. Yeah, and I think that's just it. Private sector needs to be held accountable, man. They are taking away so much money from informal traders and businesses in locals, and we just need to find a bridge between the two.
Thank you very much.
There's someone who wants to say something.
Okay.
By the power of the mic.
Thank you. I think this audience will find this really interesting. The first comment is that you can try to make biryani at the shop and you're not going to take money out of any auntie's pockets because they'll never get it right. And then the second comment is I was doing a presentation on some work I'm doing, and I show that unemployed men, employed woman in the household, a woman with a job, does more work on childcare than an unemployed man. And that is not considering the definition of unemployment doesn't consider odd jobs, or maybe he's outside the house doing this, doing that. It means not employed, just sitting at home doing nothing. So the man is sitting in the house, there's a woman who's working in the same household, and she's doing more childcare than that man, and it's about by 4 hours more. And so I presented this in a seminar, and someone said, a senior man in the department said, but that's efficient. Why? That's efficient. Why would the man do more childcare when it's more efficient to the woman to do it? And
That's patriarchy.
and so that's where my kind of debate stopped, and I just wanted to share that with this audience. And so there are senior people writing policy who think like this.
Thank you very much. Can I have a round of applause for my panelists, please?